Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in. I'm sitting down here on the shores of the Wisconsin River, and I don't know that you guys can tell, but it's about 3 feet high right now. It's ripping pretty good, which is just crazy to me because, you know, over on the Mississippi River, they are super low, but they've been getting no rain that flows into that system versus over here, northern Wisconsin has been getting a ton of rain the last couple weeks. And that's all coming down the Wisconsin River, which will flow into the Mississippi River once you get down to the southern part of the state. But right now we're high and it's ripping pretty good. And that has me wanting to talk about fishing current seams. You know, I just got back from the St. Lawrence River a couple weeks ago, and that is one of the fastest moving rivers I've ever fished. The entire Great Lakes system drains out of the St. Lawrence River. So, you know, when you think about it, that's just an unbelievable amount of water. I mean, you're talking about all the Great Lakes, all the rivers that flow into the Great Lakes. Everything gets pushed down the St. Lawrence River. And it's really not that big. It's really deep, but it's not that wide. I mean, it's, you know, wider than this, but it's like being on the Mississippi River. It's not like this giant, massive body of water, like in terms of width, but it's a super deep river, so it's got a ton of volume, and it's really a very fast current. And it can be extremely intimidating, like all rivers can. You know, if you're not familiar with fishing current, then you're going to struggle with it probably until you kind of start picking up on the nuances of where those fish are going to be holding. And so what I want to talk about today are fishing seams. You know, that's something that I was doing at the St. Lawrence River, and I'm gonna put a couple videos in here so you can see what it is that I was fishing. And if you look closely, you'll be able to see how there's a strong current line, and then, you know, in the other case, you've got strong current, and next to it you've either got a secondary current coming in or you've got a back eddy, so you've got a nice current seam. And I'll let you watch these videos and you can see where I'm throwing, and it'll kind of give you an idea as to what I want to talk about. So after watching those videos, you can see, you know, that there was a very clear line of current in them. And because of that, that is what's considered a current seam. Now, current seams can be formed in a lot of different ways, but generally it's because you have two currents that are coming together. So you may have a side chute that flows into the main channel. You may have a secondary river that flows into the main channel. You may just have an island that separates the main channel, and you have current that flows around it and forms back together. So on the upstream side, you could potentially have a current seam, and on the downstream side, you could have a current seam, you know, where literally the two currents come back together. You can also have current seams that form where the current comes and clips a shoreline. And when that happens, you could get a back eddy on one side and strong current that's flowing by on the other side. So, you know, the couple of main things that you want to know when dealing with current seams is generally that's going to be the fastest current around. So if it's a current where you have two currents coming together, where those two currents coming together are probably the two strongest currents in that area, because the water is getting pushed there, right? So if the water is getting pushed there, that's going to be the strongest point of the current. It's just like if you have a current seam that comes off the shoreline, you've got, you know, a place where the current's clipping the bank because the current's being pushed into that bank. So if you have that, you know, generally the strongest current on, say, an outside bend is where you have the current hitting the bank and where it leaves the bank, because that's where it's being pushed into the bank and where it's being pushed away from the bank. So that forms your current seam. So you know, that's the number one thing to know is when you're fishing a current seam, it's generally some of the strongest current that's in that spot. I'm not saying the entire river, I'm just saying in that spot. And when dealing with fish, a lot of times they want the strongest current possible. It's, you know, I think it kind of goes against what we would normally think of, you know, where the fish want to get completely out of the current. Well, they do, but keep in mind that if they're actively feeding, they want to be in that current and letting that current bring the food to them. So ideally, what they want is a place to get out of the current, but have that buffet of food coming by them. And that's where the current seams come into play. A lot of times with a current seam, what you don't realize is that where those two currents meet, you have a tiny little, say, eddy, a tiny little slick spot. So those fish can sit almost still in between the two currents. At the same time, if you have some item, whether it's a rock or a little drop off where the two current seams come right over the top of them, well, then you've got the best of both worlds. If you're a fish, you have two buffets bringing food to you. So there's a real reason why the fish are using the current seams. It really is all about bringing the food to the fish. And at the same time, there are areas within that current seam that they can sit and expel less energy, even though you think it would be a huge amount of energy because it's the fastest current around. So it's kind of the best of both worlds for them. That fast current brings more food to them and they can sit out of it. The hard part is figuring out exactly where they're sitting within that current seam. You could have, like say at the St. Lawrence River, the current seams, I mean, in some cases are hundreds of yards, 200 yards long. It's not just a simple eddy off the bank. So what you need to do to be really successful at fishing them is to identify the key spots within that current seam. In some cases, you may have an isolated boulder. In other cases, if you read the water perfectly, you might be able to see, hey, there's a 2-foot drop that the current seam is going right over, and that provides a place for the fish to sit. So it's up to the angler to identify where the best current seam sitting place is. So in a 200-yard stretch, there may have only been a 40-yard stretch that really held up the best. And that may have been, in my case, there were several times where there was a single rock or a couple rocks that were the size of, I'm going to say basketballs is what they looked like on my graphs. But the thing is, when you have such a fast current, that there's an eddy behind that rock for 30 feet. So they don't have to sit right behind the rock. They can be sitting a ways behind it and still have the ability to get some of the benefit of sitting behind that rock. So it's up to the angler to identify where the key sweet spot is in that current seam. But even when you do that, it's not necessarily a one cast deal. It can take many casts to figure out the exact line of where you need the cast to have that current bring your bait back by that rock or by that little drop off or just down the current seam. If you think about it, if you're trying to bring a bait right down the middle of the current seam, you may have an area that wide where if your bait's in it, it's going to be brought right down the middle. If it's, just to the right, just to the left, that current, that strong current on either side is going to grab it and just pull it down into the main current. So it's going to want to pull it away from the current seam. So just because you make 1 or 2 casts doesn't mean you're covering the exact spot. You may know exactly where they need to be, but it may take you 15, 20 casts to get your bait to be presented properly. So it's one of those things that you can't just fish a spot and be like, oh, I made 3 casts and it's done. Because the likelihood that you're going to get your bait to go by that current seam perfectly on one of your first couple of casts is not good. Once you identify where you got bit, or once you do get bit, I highly recommend trying to make that exact cast multiple times, because a lot of times there's more fish in that one little spot, but you just have to know exactly where to cast your bait. That happened several times to me at the St. Lawrence River tournament, where I fished the spot for 15-20 minutes and I never got bit, and then I made the right cast and got bit on 2 or 3 casts in a row. And that's just a matter of how I go about fishing them. What I'll normally do is I'll pull up to a seam and I'll just start making casts that are about a foot apart. If there's a section of current seam that I feel like the key area is say 20 feet or 30 feet, I'll start on one side and just make a cast, try to make a cast about a foot apart all the way across. And ideally at some point I'm going to find the right cast that the fish are using. I kind of feel like the worst thing to do is pull up make a cast over here, make a cast over here, make a cast over here. Because a lot of times you may have made 10 casts, but you really made like 5 presentations of your bait. You know, you replicated several of those casts without truly knowing that you did that. So that's kind of my approach to fishing seams. When it comes to baits, guys, it's not really about the bait as much as it is getting your bait to be in the right spot. You know, if you're fishing a body of water like the St. Lawrence where you're keying in on smallmouth, a drop shot's a great bait. You know, in that case though, I was fishing all the way down to 40 feet of water and I needed something to get me down that deep. If you're fishing something that's 4 foot of water, I mean, the bait choice is limited, or not limited. I mean, you could throw crankbaits, you could throw a dragging bait, you could throw a weightless bait, you know, you could throw a top water. It's really just a matter, again, of trying to figure out where that fish is at and bringing your bait past where they're at. So the bait presentation, in my opinion, is not, or the bait choice is not nearly as important as the presentation of the bait and being aware of where your bait's at when you do get bit, because that's what you need to know so you can replicate it. But guys, if you can figure out the current seam game, you can break rivers down really, really quick. It's not a hard thing to do. It just takes a little bit of time to try to visually read the water. It becomes much more difficult when you've got a strong wind and you can't read the current visually with your eyes. So like even on the St. Lawrence, I was using my eyes to read the current, but I may have been fishing 30 feet of water because for the most part, that current seems going to be more vertical than, you know, horizontal in the water column. So I hope this was helpful, guys. Like I said, get out there. If you don't fish rivers, it's a great way to fish, and it can become really a very easy way to fish once you understand current flow. So get out there, give it a try. Let me know how it goes for you. Stay tuned. We got new tips and tricks that come out every day.